And then, new life arrived. Cubs descendants of the Jocks were born into the prides. The kings had offspring to protect now. This wasn't just about territory anymore. It was about legacy. With vulnerable cubs in their care, the Jocks knew. They couldn't launch a full-scale attack on the cubs, not yet. They would wait. But something unexpected was already brewing within their own ranks. The youngest of the 5 brothers had become obsessed with the lionesses of the cubs' pride. He began sneaking away, following them from a distance, mesmerized by their grace and power as they hunted. His brothers noticed his absence and repeatedly brought him back, warning him that the time to claim those lionesses would come, but not now. They had cubs to protect. Starting a war at the wrong time could destroy everything. But the youngest Jock couldn't resist. Driven by desire and recklessness, he broke one of the most sacred rules of survival, crossed into enemy territory. Alone, approaching one of the cubs' dominant females as she drank from the river, she looked at him. He looked back. But it wasn't romance. It was a trap. The cubs had been watching. They struck without hesitation. The moment the youngest Jock stepped too close to the cub's queen, it was already too late. In mere seconds, the trap closed around him. Hidden in the tall grass, the 4 cubs pounced together, overwhelming the lone lion with brutal efficiency. His roars of pain echoed through the trees, but no one was there to save him. Within minutes, the youngest Jock lay lifeless on the ground, his body torn, broken, and humiliated. The cubs didn't stop there. They marked the site with their scent, urinating all around the area as a final insult. When the remaining 4 Jocks arrived, guided by the trail of blood and the unmistakable stench of dominance, they found their brother's lifeless body near the riverbank. They didn't roar immediately. They stared. And then, from the depths of their chests, a storm erupted. Their roars of rage and grief shook the savannah. It wasn't just the loss of a brother. It was betrayal, violation, and declaration of war all in one. From that moment on, everything changed. Up to this point, the Jocks had been strategic. Every move was calculated. Every battle was prepared. But now, grief clouded their judgment. The careful kings turned into angry warriors consumed by vengeance. And so, the war began. No more waiting. No more planning. The 4 Jocks charged into enemy territory, roaring with fury, ready to avenge the fallen. The cubs were prepared. They'd expected this emotional response and were waiting. When the 2 coalitions clashed, it was not a battle, it was a bloodbath. The fight lasted almost 3 hours. Claws tore flesh. Teeth broke bone. Roars drowned out the wind. Both sides gave everything, but the cubs had the edge. They were older, more experienced. And they had the advantage of preparation. Eventually wounded and exhausted, the Jocks were forced to retreat. Their bodies were battered. Their pride was shattered. But their fury only grew. They returned to their territory to heal. But there was no peace. Just 3 days later, the cubs counterattacked, while the Jocks rested in the shadows, still nursing open wounds. 2 of their cubs wandered too far from the group. The cubs struck quickly, breaking the spines of the young lions and killing them on the spot, as they had done before. They marked the scene with Uranus' second message of war. The lionesses found the bodies first. They were devastated and ran to their kings for protection, guidance, comfort. The Jocks followed them back to the scene, and once again, the smell of their enemies was heavy in the air, fueled by fresh loss. The Jocks charged toward the cubs' territory for a second time. But this time, they were still not fully recovered. The cubs were ready, and once again, they won. The Jocks retreated for the second time. Beaten, wounded, furious, they had lost a brother, 2 sons. And now, their pride was sinking into despair. They were kings. Yes, but kings at the edge of collapse. They didn't roar immediately. They stared. And then, from the depths of their chests, a storm erupted. Their roars of rage and grief shook the savannah. It wasn't just the loss of a brother. It was betrayal, violation, and declaration of war all in one. From that moment on, everything changed. Up to this point, the Jocks had been strategic. Every move was calculated. Every battle was prepared. But now, grief clouded their judgment. The careful kings turned into angry warriors consumed by vengeance. And so, the war began. No more waiting. No more planning. The four Jocks charged into enemy territory, roaring with fury, ready to avenge the fallen. The cubs were prepared. They'd expected this emotional response and were waiting. When the two coalitions clashed, it was not a battle, it was a bloodbath. The fight lasted almost 3 hours. From time to time, the vast lands of Kruger give birth to more than just animals. They give birth to legends. In 2009, deep within the heart of the Kruger National Park in South Africa, 5 lion cubs were born into a single pride. No one knew it yet, but these 5 would one day be remembered as one of the most powerful coalitions the savannah had ever seen at the time. Kruger was beginning a new research phase. The older lions that had been part of long-term observation were gone, and the park was flooded with newborns. Among the many litters, the 5 male cubs stood out early. They were healthy, strong, and displayed an unusual level of unity too. Years passed. As they reached adolescence, these young males did what nature designed them to do. They left their birth pride to form a coalition. Their goal was simple: to claim territory, take control of lionesses, and become kings. The park. Researchers noticed them immediately. Their physical condition was exceptional: thick, dark manes, and a strong, coordinated presence. They were quickly selected to be part of a new research group and fitted with tracking chips. From that point on, their journey would be recorded. In detail, they were soon given a name: the Jocks. Unlike many coalitions that split up to cover more ground, the Jocks operated as one. They rarely separated, always moving, hunting, and resting together. This tight bond became their greatest weapon. As they matured, the Jocks began surveying their surroundings. Their plan was ambitious: to take over for established prides in the area. Each pride was protected by dominant males, some older and experienced, others undefeated. But the Jocks had the numbers. 5 strong lions against smaller groups. Still, numbers alone wouldn't guarantee victory. They needed strategy. 2 of the targeted prides were led by pairs of males. Easier prey. The third had 3 defenders, more seasoned in battle. 4th was the toughest challenge, for undefeated males known as the cubs. Rulers of a powerful territory and guardians of the most skilled lionesses in the region, the Jocks knew they couldn't charge into the final battle unprepared. So they took their time. They stalked the first pride Quaggapan, Pryden, studied the routines of the reigning males. Then they attacked. It was not as easy as expected. Despite their strength and unity, the Jocks learned the hard way that experience matters in a lion fight. They won, but not without effort. Now in control of their first pride and its females, the Jocks slowed down. They had to protect what they had just conquered. Rushing into another battle would mean risking everything. Instead, they trained. They found nomadic lions wandering near their territory. Rather than attack them together, the Jocks surrounded the nomads and allowed only one member of the coalition to fight each time. One-on-one combat, over and over. They sharpened their claws, their instincts, and their minds. After weeks of tactical training and sharpening their combat instincts, the Jocks set their sights on their next target. The Noatamri pride, ruled by 2 experienced males. This time the fight was swift and decisive. The practice had paid off. The Jocks didn't just overpower their opponents, they dismantled them with precision. With 2 prides now under their control, the Jocks had reached a new level of dominance. They weren't just kings, they were becoming masters of their own destiny. Their bond remained unbreakable. Every move they made together now. It was time for their biggest challenge yet. The third pride on their map was led by 3 seasoned lion stuff, territorial and battle-tested. But the Jocks weren't the same lions they had been. Months ago, they had grown into lethal predators, physically imposing and tactically sharp. They launched their attack without hesitation. The battle was intense, but well orchestrated. The Jocks used their numbers, intelligence, and newly earned experience to overpower the trio. One by one, the defending kings fell, and with them, Another pride came under Jock control. 3 victories, 3 territories, dozens of lionesses, and cubs now relied on the Jocks for protection and leadership. Their kingdom was expanding faster than anyone expected, but far off in the distance, their final rivals were watching the cubs. The cubs had ruled their territory for over 2 years. They were undefeated in battle and widely feared. But as the Jocks gained ground, the cubs began to feel the pressure. For the first time, they sensed a real threat rising on the horizon. They studied the Jocks from afar, waiting, calculating, and searching for a weakness. Meanwhile, the Jocks began to consolidate their power. Instead of dividing themselves to patrol each pride, they brought all the lionesses together. This allowed them to maintain their greatest strength, unity. Claws tore flesh, teeth broke bone. Roars drowned out the wind. Both sides gave everything, but the cubs had the edge. They were older, more experienced, and they had the advantage of preparation. Eventually wounded and exhausted, the Jocks were forced to retreat. Their bodies were battered. Their pride was shattered. But their fury only grew. They returned to their territory to heal, but there was no peace just 3 days later. The cubs counterattacked while the Jocks rested in the shadows, still nursing open wounds. 2 of their cubs wandered too far from the group. The cubs struck quickly, breaking the spines of the young lions and killing them on the spot as they had done before. They marked the scene with Urina's second message of war. The lionesses found the bodies first. They were devastated and ran to their kings for protection, guidance, comfort. The Jocks followed them back to the scene, and once again, the smell of their enemies was heavy in the air, fueled by fresh loss. The Jocks charged toward the cubs' territory for a second time. But this time, they were still not fully recovered. Cubs were ready, and once again, the Jocks retreated for the second time. Beaten, wounded, furious. They had lost a brother, 2 sons, and now their pride was sinking into despair. They were kings, yes, but kings at the edge of collapse. The message was clear. Either they controlled their emotions and returned to strategy, or they would lose everything to the cubs. This time, they made a different choice. They gathered their lionesses and moved slightly away from there. Central territory, not abandoning it, but pulling back just enough to protect what mattered most. The rest of their cubs, they rested, they healed, and they waited, but the cubs didn't stop. The cubs didn't stop. They moved through the shadows like ghosts, looking for one more weakness to exploit. They had already taken a brother, then 2 cubs, but they wanted to send a message that could not be ignored, and so they struck again. This time, the victim was not a cub but a queen. She had gone hunting with 2 other lionesses, returning alone. With the kill, the cubs ambushed her in silence. She never made it back. Another scar on the Jocks' hearts. But this time, the Jocks did not act on impulse. They remained in place, holding their territory, comforting their pride. Their roars echoed through the night, not as a call to battle, but as a cry of mourning, of anger held tight inside burning chests. They knew now that emotion had nearly destroyed them, so they waited. For days, the cubs prowled the border, watching. But the Jocks didn't take the bait. Their wounds were healing, and so was their focus. Then came the final straw. A young lioness, just a few months old, wandered too far. Alone, she never stood a chance. The cubs killed her, and once again marked the site with their scent, expecting the same fury-driven response as before, but nothing came. No roars, no charge, just silence. The cubs were confused. Had the Jocks given up? They hadn't. They were planning something else, a trap. The Jocks began patrolling during the day, more visible and more present. When the cubs entered their land, they were met with 4 healthy, alert lions. For the first time, the cubs backed off. They believed the war had cooled, but the Jocks were only just beginning. Days later, the Jocks invaded cubs' territory, agent quietly, carefully. They found one of the cubs alone, mating with a lioness. This was the moment they had waited for. They attacked fast and without mercy. The cub never stood a chance. The Jocks killed him, spared the lioness not out of mercy, but because they believed one day she would belong to them. Then they hid. They waited in silence, hidden in the thick brush, watching as the remaining 3 cubs found the body of their fallen brother. And just as grief took hold, the Jocks attacked with a fury. Sharpened by patience and a plan forged through loss, the Jocks charged out of the bushes and caught their enemies off guard. The fight that followed was brutal and final. Massive blows, crushing bites, roars of vengeance and blood. By the time the dust settled, cubs had fallen. The war was over. The Jocks were now rulers of all 4 territories they had once only dreamed. Oof. They had lost brothers, cubs, and queens, but they had won the greatest war ever recorded between lion coalitions in Kruger. In the end, it wasn't just strength that secured their victory. It was intelligence, discipline, and unity. Their reign continued for years, and in July 2023, trackers confirmed that the surviving Jocks were still alive, nearly 14 years old, still reproducing, still ruling. They were no longer just lions. They were legends.